In a civilization that avoids suffering, challenge, emphasizes instant gratification, silos and compartmentalizes struggle and pain, we need something else that we can tap into in parallel that keeps us sober, raw, and connected to reality. And highlighted in the communities of Mount Athos, they have been outliving society for millennia, and they're not taking drugs, they're not doing anything too fancy, but what they are doing is fasting in a particular way. And so don't ask me if to eat a food of one sort or another is sinful, but recognize that if you don't fast, you will sin. It's almost like God is screaming out, people, please just fast.
Welcome back to the Raised and Redeemed podcast. Today, we're exploring the ancient practice of fasting through both a medical and Orthodox Christian lens. For many people, fasting brings up confusion and even fear. Why would God care about what we eat? Is this some kind of works-based salvation the Orthodox Christians follow? Is Orthodox Christian fasting even good for the body? And how could something as simple as food be connected to healing our trauma and PTSD and aiding in our spiritual growth? To explore these questions, I'm joined by Dr. Patitsas. Did I say that right?
Perfect.
Okay, an ER doctor and Orthodox Christian. As someone who encounters the human body at its most vulnerable moments, Dr. Pete offers a unique perspective on how physical health, spiritual discipline, and healing intersect. In this conversation, we'll discuss what fasting truly is, why God gives it to us as a spiritual tool, what distinguishes Orthodox fasting and the Athos way of eating from modern diet culture, and how fasting, when practiced with discernment and within the life of the church, can support healing of both the body and soul. So, as I mentioned to you, Dr. P, I have been avoiding this conversation because fasting is so hard for us. It's the next step of what we were trying to grow in 2025. But I finally said, okay, I'm ready. Let's have this conversation. So thank you so much for being here to educate us.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I know we've been in contact for a bit of time, and again, I just so glad that the stars aligned for us to meet today. We just finished, you might say, the nativity fast. We're all in the mode of feasting right now, which is very natural, very normal. And I think everyone needs to realize sometimes that in our efforts of fasting, we're not saying that there shouldn't be periods of feasting. And in some ways, fasting's such a cool thing. I mean, there's this sort of micro and macrocosm, like. By fasting like monks of Athos, every day you're creating these conditions of feasting and famine. And I think that's very important. It's almost like a fractal. Like every day sort of mimics sort of a grander scale of something. And in a civilization that avoids suffering, challenge, emphasizes instant gratification, silos and compartmentalizes struggle and pain. We need something else that we can tap into in parallel that keeps us sober, raw, and connected to reality. Because I always go back to this Titanic example. In fact, I just had my kids watch that film for the first time ever. I have 4 kids, so 2 of them we had to fast forward through some scenes. But anyway, point though is that at the end of that film, you see this incredible contrast between sort of those people who really just didn't understand the realities of what was coming. And then you saw this extraordinary reaction of people that, ultimately resulted in the death of hundreds of people through a combination of sort of like denial and at the same time not taking the higher road and not being the heroes and writing the stories of heroism that tragedy could have been. So one way or another, whether we prevent a situation like that, deal with the situation, there's always a way to write that story so that heroism could have been known. But in that case, it wasn't. And I just always like to remind specifically ourselves who are blessed to live in America that, tragedy is inevitable. It really is. And I'm an ER doc that works day shifts, night shifts, 12-hour shifts, 24-hour shifts. And I see a lot of struggle in my community. And it's something that needs to be said, but I always like to emphasize the miracle of Western medicine is not that we heal people. the miracle of our times is that we don't all die 100 different ways every day. So there's
Hmm.
just a lot of stuff that could occur that doesn't. And this idea of prevention, which, is gaining more and more sort of momentum, I think, in America, really
Yeah.
needs to be taken seriously. And when it comes to our Orthodox faith and Christian living in general, there is something so incredibly Christian and accessible and universal about this practice of fasting that is only mentioned 70 times between the Old and New Testament. I mean, it's almost like God is screaming out, People, please just
Yes.
fast." And the
Yeah.
reason I emphasize that is because maybe upwards of 90% of all disease is entirely preventable. And as far as I can tell from my review of the literature, understanding the physiology, the anatomy of this practice called fasting, it is that something that could have us sidestep 90% of all of those tragedies in our life. And, you know,
Yeah.
we, but what's so funny about it though is it comes with a cost. Like you can't just avoid the 90% without putting in the work and having the struggle. But many things are that way. Exercise is that way. Education is that way. Marriage is that way. Everything is that way. And so, in that
Mhm.
regard, I think that if we can take something as visceral and core as what we eat and when we eat and how much we eat, that we can really use those principles in every other aspect of our lives and make huge differences in real, meaningful ways.
Yeah, you bring up such a good point too, how it's like people always ask, why God, why? Like, why are all these
Yeah.
bad things happening? The sicknesses, deaths, all these things. And I think I heard you say it in the last, you sent me a really good podcast you were in, and you
Oh,
said,
thank you.
before we ask why God, why, let's deal with the 80% that we could deal with
Yes.
by taking care of our own health, and applying these principles that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And being in the ER, I face that every day. Like it's unavoidable for me
Yeah.
to not see the connections between a person showing up with their first heart attack at 40, to see kids that are teenagers that are on Lipitor and cholesterol drugs when they're like 10. Um,
Wow.
some people are taking Ozempic in their teenage years, and
Oh, yeah.
some of that is just like a craze. Some of it's really problematic, but anyway, yes, there are other ways to rein in these tragedies and these sorrows, and fasting is one of those tools.
Well, that was actually going to be my next question is, why would you as an emergency room doctor be the best position to talk about this? Well, it's all these tragedies you see in the correlation with diet that you
Yeah.
see. Can you just talk about that a little bit more, like
Yeah,
how this impacts people?
it's a funny thing. I mean, I think in some ways, the ER kind of reminds me of the story of Genesis. I cannot help but see the connection. And what I want to emphasize is this: when Adam and Eve made this big mistake, which of course was one of fasting, they weren't supposed to eat something. I really think that's a literal story.
Hmm.
And I'll talk about why God creating an eating rule was so important and so core. But in any case, Adam and Eve were cast out of paradise with three promises. Three. And it was that there was going to be a whole bunch of pain, a whole bunch of work, and death had entered the world. And so what
Mm.
I want to say is this: if you're going to a party and I tell you at this party there's going to be salsa dance, there's going to be subs, and there's going to be punch, you dress for that. You expect that. If they start suddenly playing Metallica, there's no food and there's no, and instead they serve you water, you're kind of like disoriented. And I think to some extent what has happened in especially in 21st century civilization is that we need to understand that at our core, the only three promises from God were pain, work, and death. And if we are
Yeah.
expecting anything more than that, things aren't going to go well. Like we're going to be surprised. Now, with that
Uh-huh.
said, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be Christian and do things that we can to alleviate those things. It's just that we can't be disconnected and disoriented. And
Yeah.
so I always find this is really cool. There was an ancient Greek like playwright. His name was Aeschylus, and he was known for writing all these incredible plays. I mean, imagine like if Steven Spielberg was being like they were doing an autobiography of his life. Okay, so something on that level of fame. So when Aeschylus died, or about he was about to die, he had one request, And his request was on his tombstone, he wanted only mentioned that he was in the Battle of Thermopylae. That's it. He didn't want anything mentioned about his playwright, books, but it will almost be as if Steven Spielberg, when he dies, says, "You know what, people, please don't remember anything I did with all these different films and blockbuster hits. I want you just to remember I was in the National Guard." And the
Mm,
reason is, and of course, Steven Spielberg hasn't, announced that yet. But the point I bring up is there's something so incredibly real about pain, work, and death that we
mm,
all connect with. It's almost like in some ways in America, we have a little bit too confused. Like we have a victim culture where all people
yeah.
want to talk about is these things that happen to them, and they're not processing it in a way I would call that is healthy. But there is something to be respected in that. Like when they tell you about their tragedies, there is something very real there they're sharing with you that is a more than just the real of, oh, I went to a concert and had a great time. Like we're
Hmm.
happy for them, but it doesn't really move us as much. And
Yeah.
and I think that's because this reality is like gravity. These are the three promises from God in this new world. And so anyway, what I bring back to center is to say the emergency room is that post paradise environment. It is work,
Mm,
it is pain, and it is death. And
yeah.
actually, I think it's important to mention the average ER, let's call it staff member, can be nurses or docs or mid levels. We actually see more death than the average modern American soldier. Like,
Wow.
it's very counterintuitive, but in your zip code, there is a lot of suffering going on, and we all have this farsightedness of things that are happening far away, but the reality is there are a lot of extraordinary people just in your zip code who are operating in this ultimate reality, and that's where gravity is, and if you're trying to derive wisdom, that you need to be facing truth to do that, and if you're not participating in those 3 fields to some extent, you're not gonna be able to see the world for what it is, and then how can you really judge what is true and what is false, given that backdrop? So, that's why the ER is a place where we need to where we get to learn and see these patterns, and it's real, and it's important.
Yeah. Yeah. So is most of what you see self-induced versus like crazy tragedies of, a car accident? Is most of what you see in the ER like health related from people's lack of care of themselves?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mix, but, I mean,
Okay.
I will tell you, it is I just took care of a child, not too long ago. It was an infant that had been punched in the in the head
Oh
by
my
their
gosh.
father, skull fractures, internal bleeding, seizures.
Mhm.
It didn't end well, but the reason that even happened was all because of preventable things.
Yeah.
And so you could say that's traumatic, it's terrible, what a disaster, and it was. That's a recipe for PTSD. I don't think this child will ever be the same. By the way, it survived. But the point though is that when you peel back the story, you try to understand what led that father to be in such a desperate moment to act that way. And I'm sure
Mhm.
all of us as parents, they say that the difference between crazy and not, we all think the same things, but we don't do them. That's the
Yeah.
that's the key. Um, there were some societal things and some drug related things and some other stuff that played into that result. But yeah, I mean, I see a mixture of everything. I would say most of it is preventable, and of course, if you haven't taken care of your health and you have diabetes and you're frail and you're sarcopenic and there's a way to age with grace, and if you don't, pneumonia hits you even harder, if that
Mhm.
makes sense. So
Mhm.
yes, we're going to stumble, we're going to fall, we're going to have problems, we're going to get illness, but the recovery is very much correlated to how well you went into it, and all of
Mhm.
those things are optimizable. So I would say it's very rare that I have a child that shows up with some type of genetic congenital disorder that causes the problem that day. It's usually this is a summarization of a lifestyle of a lifetime of bad decisions or less than optimal ones.
Well, you bring up a good point, even mentioning the father and the baby, because this ties into how we're gonna lead into this conversation about fasting is how it's this tool to learn to overcome the passions.
Mhm.
And so in this instant that this father tragically did this, it just shows how little control he had over his own
Hmm.
self and his own passions, and how fasting is given to us as a tool to grow in that discipline, um, to control oneself and to tame one's passions, and so it does tie in, like, that total lack of control, and, you get into substance abusing. That's how do I say this? Something I wanna bring up is, like, I used to have a past of substance abusing and just doing whatever my passions wanted me to do, and now I'm fine-tuning, getting closer to God, and now I'm, like, nitpicking the food I eat as, like, the next closer level of trying to get closer to God. So, um, I think that is one of, like, if you're not doing all those other things, how do I say? It's like, obviously, if you're abusing drugs, cut out those things first, fast from those things first, and then we can get into the deeper growth of fasting food, right?
Yeah, so this is the key, and I think I'll just talk about the anatomy just briefly, and I'll make this point sort of shine. The reason that fasting is a spiritual practice is because we get to play with these principles and these virtues and vices in a low risk environment with
Yeah.
just as much visceral response. This is what I mean by that. So, our enteric nervous system lines the 30 feet of our gut. There's 100 million neurons that are a part of that intestinal system. There's 100 trillion bacteria in your gut that make things like serotonin and cofactors and enzymes that help us not just break down food, but then our chemicals we need for human living, human thriving. The intestine itself is so sensitive that if I were to put a needle through just a little part of your intestine, a needle, we call that a microperforation, the pain is unbearable. I mean, you could put a needle in your arm all the time, right? Heroin addicts do it all the time. They're not writhing on the ground, as if something went wrong. It's a little pinch, it's a burn, it's over. You do that to the intestine, and it is a big problem. Um, 10 to about 20% of our metabolism is just for digesting. So this system of digestion is complex, it's sensitive, it's high energy, it's massive, and it's core to us. Why is that important? Because if I want to teach you the spiritual elements of the journey, I want you to feel those things. I don't it's funny, like when children or people who are different heights and IQs and they eat different things and they live in different parts of the world, they all have an enteric nervous system. They all have an intestine. They all are limited by these parameters. And so if I can manipulate and utilize that system for learning through a visceral experience like fasting, because it is visceral. I mean, when you're hungry, it's undeniable. You can't avoid it. You can't stop thinking about it.
Mhm.
Um, I've met some people that are like truly addicted to food. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a very visceral experience. So if I can get a child to learn those principles of self-restraint, a extended time horizon, what it means to feast, what it means to prepare, what it means to wait, to delay gratification. If I can get them to feel it at such a core level, they can use that same principle in every other aspect of their life, whether
Yeah.
that's addiction, whether that's for
Yeah.
their employer, whether that's for their marriage, teaching their child something. All of this is learned in a visceral way at the most core level in through the practice of fasting. And
Yeah.
so it's not that food is sinful. It's not that meat is bad. What I like to tell people is don't ask me if to eat a food of one sort or another is sinful, but recognize that if you don't fast, you will sin.
Mhm.
So this
Yes,
is
you brought the point home. You said you would, and you did.
Yeah, right. And so all of this is just like a universe of principalities and good versus evil and virtues versus vice. And I always like to bring up this example because I lived it. But when you're, 7 or 8 years old and you're told by your parents, it's not a this is a fasting day. You can't have dairy, you can't have meat. And little Johnny's birthday party just happens to be on a Wednesday and a Friday. And that cupcake with all of its buttercream and sprinkles, etc., is right in front of you. I'm telling you that that experience for a child is so intense, it's so
Yeah.
visceral that if I can get them to overcome that, they probably won't feel the need to abuse drugs. They
Yes.
probably won't be as quick to anger. They probably will learn not to judge. In fact, I just had my son a few months ago. He said, "Dad, I wasn't eating this stuff everyone else was, and I was really judgmental." I'm like, "Perfect. Do that another 50 times, and eventually you won't even care. Like you
Mm,
won't be judgmental. But that was at a that lesson was learned not through a book, not through memorizing 5 tenets. It was felt. It was felt at a core and key level.
wow.
And this is why fasting is that button for learning these spiritual principles. And there's
Mhm,
no other more effective tool. At the very least, I know people that have never exercised a day in their life. They've never gone to church. They avoid school like it's the plague. But food is something you have to engage with every day.
mhm.
And so in that regard, this is why it's a Christian, like it's a Christian practice, because it's universal. It's something that you have to face every day. And so living that Christian life through fasting can truly change you in the most core way.
Yes, and one of my next questions is gonna be what actually is Orthodox
Yeah.
fasting, but just on the point of your son, I love that story, and I'm just curious, I mean, my daughter's she's almost 2. What age can
Yeah.
you begin teaching them this?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a great point. So I would say, 7 actually through the oral traditions of the church seems to be that magical age. I also find it interesting that a lot of ancient societies tended to bring in their sons and daughters into various like unions and apprenticeships around that age. So there's something about development around that time where I think a
Oh,
child really can forego certain food items. And again, if you follow it in an orthodox way, there is periods of feasting. There are times where you can load up on all sorts of good food, but there are a lot of times of let's say famine of the fasting part. And so
mhm.
7 is my number where to say, hey, prior to that, kids tend to eat what their parents do, and they tend to eat when their parents do. But in terms of
Yep.
like an intentionality, at 7, that's when they cross over and they start having to say, hey, let's start to take this seriously. And again, it sounds so extreme when like kids will just like birds fly because their parents fly. Dolphins, sing because their parents sing. Like all of these animals in the animal kingdom just do what their parents do. And by the
Yeah,
time they know that they had done something extraordinary, it was just like, oh, that's just what we do. Like we
yeah.
of course we fly at 200 miles an hour, at 20,000 feet like falcons. Like that's just what we do. And
Yes.
so we're all these superhumans. We don't even realize it. And so that's the thing. Another thing I'd like to say is, pregnant ladies shouldn't fast. But there is a lot of evidence that shows that no one should be eating more than 12 hours a day, unless you're an
Okay.
infant. Really, really is. But anyway, we'll talk about more of the particulars of what fasting means in this optimal way. But yes, I would say 7 is that historic, ancient, Orthodox standard of when fasting turns on.
Okay, yeah, that's what I've heard before. I've had people tell me like, "Oh my gosh, how could I get my toddler?" Like, they yell they want this. I'm like,
No, no,
"No, don't worry about it with
yeah,
the
don't worry,
toddlers yet."
don't worry.
But no, that's a good point. They're gonna eat what you eat. They're gonna eat what you have in the house. So this is something I really want my husband and I to grow in. That was my 2025 goal. We fell back a little bit. I've talked about it on my
Yeah.
podcast, but hopefully in this next coming year, it's something we can step into more fully.
Well,
I also
it's why the spiritual path is a lifelong practice. And
yeah.
and luckily we get to do version 2.0 and 2.5 million, as we get older and we get credit for that, even though we might have been shortcoming in the beginning. And so that's just fine. Like a lot of these things take repetition of success and failure, and eventually you're where you need to be. Um,
Yes, and it becomes routine one day,
yes,
hopefully.
yes.
Hopefully. So in this culture of, like, there's so many different diets and things that are, like, there's the carnivore diet and there's, just veganism or all these different things. What exactly is Orthodox fasting? What sets that apart? And is that the same as the Athos diet?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I would like to say that the Athos diet is Orthodox fasting done optimally, so that
Okay,
not only are you getting the spiritual benefit, you're getting the physical benefit as well, and they both should resonate together. They really should. And I was mentioning I started fasting when I was at 7, but the most baseline generic Orthodox parameters for fasting are the following: no meat and no dairy, and none of those ingredients can be in the foods that you're about to eat.
okay.
Okay. It doesn't say when you should eat. It doesn't say how much of that you should eat. It doesn't say whether or not it's good to eat processed foods, that are
Mhm.
non-dairy, non meat, sort of oriented. None of that. So when I'm, 10 or 11, I mean, granted, I went through the practice of not, um, I went through the practice of fasting so that I did restrain myself in many ways. But I was a husky kid. I ate all the white bread and candy I wanted.
Because
That's
that's fast approved,
Yeah,
Orthodox fast
exactly,
approved.
exactly. And
Mhm.
so I was not a healthy teenager at all.
Yeah.
So what Orthodox fasting should be, and this is where I've come through and examined practices of Orthodox fasting around the world, specifically in monasteries, and highlighted in the communities of Mount Athos, which is a peninsula in Greece that's been around for at least 1,200 years. They have been outliving society for millennia, and they're not taking drugs. They're not doing anything too fancy, but what they are doing is fasting in a particular way. And so what I'm trying to do is to bring out those best practices to the 300 million Orthodox Christians worldwide, so that we can outlive our enemies. Be
Yeah.
fertile, be functional, be vibrant, productive, vital. And that's what comes with this territory. In the New Testament, it talks about how when you fast, don't cover yourself with ashes and look, forlorn. Cover yourself in oil and look radiant. I take that passage as actually a litmus test. If you're doing fasting right, these steps in fasting should make you feel better, not
Mm.
worse.
Uh-huh.
And of course, we all like to eat the next piece of cake and the next steak, etc. But there's always a little bit of a turmoil with going back and forth. But the point, though, is that I do have more energy. I do have better health when I fast. It's a wonderful clean out. It's a wonderful reset. And so in that regard, you can Orthodox fast and avoid meat and dairy, but you can really abuse and game the system so that you're still eating way too much, all the wrong stuff, and you're putting on weight. And so in this way, the Athos diet sort of takes three specific parameters and sort of adds them into that mix and says, hey,
Okay.
if you include these as well, then you're gonna really have healingable soul and body. And these are the three. The first is intermittent fasting. So the monks of Mount Athos, many of them specifically during Lent and other times, they won't eat until the ninth hour. That's when Christ was crucified. That's when he died. S-
Okay.
God didn't have food. Jesus didn't have food until the ninth hour, neither will I. So that was their motivation, to suffer with him, Okay. Second, many monks at Mount Athos try to have communion every day. And I'm sure, as you're well aware, Michaela, we're supposed to not eat prior to having communion. That's intermittent
Right.
fasting. So what I think is just so cool, it's like before we even knew the phrase intermittent fasting, before we knew the science or the medical benefit or the longevity benefit, et cetera, they had this discipline, this tradition, the wanting to suffer with Christ. And as a result, the same maker who asked us to fast creates into the engineering of our physiology, of our anatomy, a process of healing. So that when
Mhm.
you find these monks in the 80s and 90s and even hundreds, they don't have Parkinson's, they don't have diabetes, they don't have neurodegenerative disorders, and they are healthy, high functioning people. And of course, they're the last people on earth that really care about living long. But that comes with the
Yeah.
medicine. That's the sweetness to the medicine of this practice. Um, I always
Yeah,
like to
like
tell,
the people
yeah.
in the Bible lived, like, hundreds of years.
Well, I always joke around, if Adam and Eve really did live for hundreds of years, and I'm sure they did, I'm sure they intermittent fasted, you know,
Yes.
and it's also interesting that prior until Noah, after Noah's flood, there really was no direct commandment. Like, it's funny, he leaves the ark, and God tells him specifically, you can start to eat meat. I mean, as if it
Yeah.
was assumed that you would not eat meat prior to Noah's time. What's that all about? Well, the Orthodox Church recommends periods of the year, a great deal of it actually, about over half the year, where we don't eat meat. And what does that do to our inflammatory levels? What does that do to, cancer risk, obesity risk? And we need to be aware, there's 12 different types of cancers that are just correlated with obesity.
Wow.
Um, Prostate cancer in places where they don't eat meat, like, doesn't even exist. Colon
Hmm.
cancer, the same thing. And so there's a lot of benefit for sort of a plant-based diet. Now, the second prong of the diet, as I mentioned, is plant-based stuff, but it's really to emphasize you need a lot more protein than you've been consuming, and you need to go as low carb as possible. And
Okay.
this is where in 2025, I mean, I'm sure, the soils were even better, prior to industrialization, et cetera. there's a lot of studies that suggest that there was more protein and more nutritional content in the average plant prior to modern times. But with that said, I try to get people to have at least 100 grams of protein a day and no more than about 130 to 160 grams of carbs a day. And there's no limit on fat. And
Hmm.
then the last prong is just walking, which actually is like of all the exercises that exist, whether it's weightlifting or high intensity workouts or whatever, walking truly is like the mega medicine for just everything. I mean, people
Yeah.
who walk every day have lower risks of depression. They have lower risks of, I mean, essentially it's just like all cause everything awesome. Keep walking,
Yeah.
is sort of the way. And so when you bring these three practices to Orthodox fasting, suddenly now it's interesting to find out that any mammal that intermittent fasts lives 30 to 40% longer just
Hmm.
just by condensing the window to when they eat. So in the Athos diet, we don't want anyone eating more than 8 hours a day. Some
Okay.
people go as aggressive as 4 hours a day, but they can
Wow.
eat all they want within that window. Um, and what happens is you can only eat so much in that window, and at the same time, you're more intentional about it. And I think
Hmm.
it's very interesting. There's two major factors that tell us, or that synchronize, I should say, 80% of our genes. 80% of our genes. That's when we see light for the first time and when we eat. So if you're like the average American who eats um, 11 times over 15 hours a day, you are in absolute metabolic confusion. Your body doesn't know if I'm digesting, if I'm absorbing, if I'm
Yeah.
excreting, if they completely in disarray. And so what we do by creating this ritual of famine and feasting throughout your day in a 24-hour period is we get everything synchronized and aligned. And this is very powerful. And it one way or another, it translates into living 40% longer, at
Wow.
least at least that.
I know people who are in fitness programs where their trainer is having them eat small meals like every couple hours.
Yeah.
What is your take on something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to find out. There was this famous wrestler in the '80s, and he essentially had a pituitary tumor in his brain, and he secreted so much growth hormone. The guy was a giant, huge jaw. He was literally like 500 pounds. He did not live long, but anyway, this growth hormone tumor made him essentially like superhuman. I mean, he was a wrestler. He utilized that gift in his own way. His name was Andre the Giant. Literally, his go-to name is the Giant. So, um, when you intermittent fast, you release growth hormone, and that's in addition to how much you would normally release. In fact, on a daily level, depending on how long you do your fasting, at least 16 hours of fasting, maybe you could go as long as 20, 200 to 500% increase in growth hormone release.
Is that good for women?
That's great for women. It helps
Okay.
with skin, collagen, their menstrual cycles.
Not becoming buff. It won't
No.
make them buff.
Well, it
Okay.
it improves the amount of lean mass that you have, but
Okay.
it's not to the extent of the growth hormone tumor that this guy had. It's
Okay.
this is a healthy physiological range of having it. But the reason I'm bringing it up is by the time you're 40 and definitely by the time you're 50, you are naturally secreting about 50% of what you used to make of that hormone. So
Mm.
how do we overcome that? We do orthodox fasting. And you only eat, 8, maybe as little as 4 hours a day, and suddenly you're getting this 200% to 500% increase in this very valuable hormone. That if you
Mhm.
Google this, it's incredible the benefits of growth hormone. I mean, there's an entire industry on people that take it, exogenously. They inject it in themselves, and it's for vanity. But the point is that there's a way to get it naturally, and it's through intermittent fasting. It's also through sleeping. It's also through exercise. But this is the thing. It's like I know a lot of people that don't want to exercise. We live in a 24-hour world where sleep is kind of difficult. The kids are waking up at night. How else could I get my growth hormone? Well, it's through this
Fasting.
fasting practice. And so
Yeah.
that's one of the things. The other thing too you have to keep in mind is, for a woman going through her 28-day or maybe 32-day menstrual cycle, there's always a range, but that's a cycle that occurs every so often. Well, if you want to get the 28-day cycle in order, you need to get your 24-hour cycle in order. So
Mm.
eat at the same time every day. And like I said, 80% of your genes are correlated to when you eat. So I do think that there are a lot of women with PCOS and irregular menstrual
Mm.
cycles and heavy bleeding, etc., that could really overcome this problem if they just ate in a very ceremonial manner, as in the same
Mm.
time every day, no matter what. And so that's one of these powerful things about intermittent fasting. Um, but remember, again, this practice wasn't like the monks sitting down 1,200 years ago and saying, "How do we get more growth hormone?" Or
Yeah.
how do we live forever? Or how do we avoid neurodegenerative disease? They had a spiritual aim that was based on suffering with Christ, and God in the engineering of our world made this little sweetness to the medicine, and it's an incredible medicine. It really is.
Yeah, that's interesting, like, they were focusing on communion, but
Yes.
they received the physical benefits and the longevity
And
nonetheless.
isn't it interesting that right before communion, the final prayer is for the healing of soul and body? Like communion is for
Wow.
healing of both soul and body. The temple of our soul is valuable. And why is it that in the resurrection our bodies are to be resurrected as well? Like we're not supposed to be just like ghosts or souls. We will have a
Right.
physical body. It'll be a transformed one, a transfigured one, a resurrected one. But there's something valuable about the material world. In fact, I always like to say this too, and forgive me for being theological, but it was because of creation that we discovered the Trinity. We didn't even know there was a Trinity until God became man. So there's
Mm,
there's something valuable about creation and our bodies and this physical world that gives us insight into the spiritual. And
yeah.
again, there's no better bridge between the spiritual and the physical than fasting. And I think all the signs suggest that when we take our health seriously and we beautify our body in a virtuous way, everything benefits. Everything benefits.
Yeah, I have so many, like, thoughts and questions bouncing off that, but one of the most recent conversations, I think it was the one directly before this, was with Father Photius, and we were talking about the saints
Mhm.
having incorruptible bodies because
Mm.
they've grown so close to Christ and the grace that has come into their body, and you heal the soul through these ascetical practices, and it heals the body as well. Um, and how like you mentioned a good point too, the resurrection of the body, like, somehow
Yes.
these bodies are gonna go with us. I don't
Yeah.
get it, but
Yeah, yeah.
we
No, it's a
better take care of
mystery. It's
them.
it's a mystery, but it's something important. And I will emphasize this just as a medical doctor that's done anatomy labs and taking care of bodies. I mean, the idea that a body remains incorrupt is absolutely a miracle. It's impossible. I mean, when you consider what we do to get a cadaver to last 6 or 7 weeks so that we can do anatomy lab on, I mean, it is breaking down instantly. It's not a fun class, but the point though is that for something to just be placed in the ground with all of that flora, fauna, worm, and you bring it out 3 years later and it's incorrupt, I mean, that is as impossible as flying. I mean, it really is. It's an extraordinary thing. So, yes, there is something there, and why would God reveal that type of a miracle to us except to emphasize the importance of the body and the grace-filled
Mhm.
person that was experiencing that miracle. It's pretty extraordinary.
You know what's interesting too is when I listen to the Synaxarion in the morning, so many of
Uh,
these saints and monks, they survived on a little bit of bread, like in a
mm.
cave. They're just eating a little bit of bread. How does that I mean, how did that even sustain them? I guess it had to have been God sustaining them through that, right?
Well, I think that there is, first of all, we don't know our own power. So the longest person to ever go without food was over a year. He was a morbidly obese person, but he lost like 300 plus pounds of his weight in a year. He
What?
only had water and electrolytes, maybe some broth, but essentially, the average American's like 60 to 70 pounds overweight. I mean, we could
Mm.
easily go 60 days without food. As long as we're getting water and electrolytes, we'd be fine. And you might even argue actually with ketosis, and we could talk about this too. But once you break through all those sugar storages in your liver and in your muscles, you are just burning your own fat. Well, what's cool about that is when you're only burning your own fat, your energy level stays high and stable, like constantly until further
Mm.
notice. It's not like we're dependent on sugars. Oh, we eat some food, the sugar goes up, the insulin goes up, now we crash and back and forth all day long. In fact, that's why a lot of people snack all day is because they're trying to keep like a nice steady energy supply that's pretty much impossible to achieve without ketosis.
I
So,
snack all day. I'm gonna
exactly.
confess, I snack all day.
Well, no, I mean, again, it's not to say there's anything like terrible about the idea. It's just that like when you take that and scale it up to a population, that does that all day,
Mhm.
you end up getting 74% of people overweight and 40%
Yeah.
obese, and the problems we have in America. Now, there's always outliers, and when you're young, you can get away with a lot of stuff. But as you get older and these hormones start to change pattern, estrogen levels change, progesterone levels change, growth hormone levels change, you don't have the hormonal metabolic profile to get away with that stuff anymore.
Yeah.
So by all means, go into your middle age with these best practices and you'll do well. I mean, I just turned 41 a few weeks ago. I mean, I do night shifts. I work 24-hour shifts. I have 4 kids. I've been woken up at night. Like I'm doing fine. Like I'm not a victim of fasting. I'm actually thriving as a result of it.
Mhm.
And,
Oh,
actually, a lot of my coworkers are like, "Oh, we're having this food in the back, Pete, some donuts. You want some? Oh, we know you never eat during your shifts." It's like, "Yeah, I don't eat during my shifts." Like Pete never eats. The point is that we can certainly get through 24 hours without food. Now, the Athos diet just requires 16 hours, but we can certainly get 24
mhm.
hours. But we are actually polar bears in the desert. I always like to say this. We are animals that are capable of so much more than we realize. And what
Yeah.
civilization's done is it's taken that poor polar bear, who's the largest land mammal in the world, predator in the world, and said, "You know what, polar bear, we really feel bad that you have to be in the Arctic in that cold water. Let's put you in a place where it's always warm, called the desert, and see how you do." And like the polar bear does not thrive. And I like
Mhm.
to say the same thing. It's like we've taken ourselves out of our natural environment and we've taken ourselves out of this realm of work and pain and at least taking on death to some extent, and we're wondering why we're all depressed.
Yeah.
25% of women are have anxiety or depression in America.
Mhm.
50,000 people a year commit suicide. 100,000 people or more overdose on one substance or another. There's a lot of disorientation going on there. People are confused,
Yeah.
they're down. And this is a practice that might get us reset, and it's all about
Yeah.
fasting.
Yeah, and we're not taught to struggle well from early
Right.
childhood like we talked about. So these principles and practices go with us in life, and yeah, that's a good point. I guess let's jump into some specifics. We've talked a little about the specifics, but people don't need to be taking notes right now, right? Like you have a book and
Yeah.
there's a program.
Yeah, yeah, there's a book, there's a program, and also on my YouTube site, I go through a lot of the particulars through like 3 to 5 minute videos on different aspects of this. But yeah, I
Okay.
mean, but the rubric essentially is intermittent fasting. No eating beyond 8 hours a day. It's high protein, it's low carb, but with a plant based source. And just to convince you otherwise, and I always like to tell people, if you look at the protein content for the calories you get from eating an egg, you get like 7 grams of protein, um, well, actually, let's put it a different way. For every gram of protein you get, it's like 10 to 12 calories that you need because there's a lot
Mhm.
of other stuff in the egg, okay, that come with the protein that make the calorie content high. On the other side, it's like a frustrating thing. You ever get those plant-based protein bars, right? 20 grams of protein. Oh, phenomenal. I love 20 grams. But the calorie content's like 800 calories.
Yeah.
That's no fun. But if you have hemp protein, pea protein, if you eat shrimp, which is blessed during the fasting times, if you eat spirulina, lentils, all of these things are super high in protein. They're actually better than eggs in terms of protein to
Mm.
calorie ratio. So there are definitely ways to get your protein up and your carbs down and your calories down for that matter. And so anyway, that's just something sort of mechanical to keep in mind. But then with the
Yeah.
walking, we just ask people to walk no less than 30 minutes a day. The studies show 30 minutes a day is like the sweet spot for getting return on investment for your walking.
Okay. No, I'm glad that you brought up the difference in proteins between animal products and, um, I guess, vegan products, because
Yes.
that's one thing I struggle with is when we first began fasting, I've found our house full of all these Trader Joe's
Yes.
processed, packaged,
Yeah.
vegan, fast-friendly foods, and I was like, I would rather just eat like a Whole Foods
Yes.
egg and yogurt than like a cashew yogurt that has 15 plus ingredients in it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
no, you're absolutely right. There is a little bit of in the goal of making things taste like meat, even though it's not meat, and the goal of making it try to seem like yogurt when it's not. We're definitely in the early cultural phases of figuring those things out. But there are
Right.
societies out there in Ukraine and Russia and Greece and Romania and Bulgaria where they've developed a culture surrounding this fasting practice, and
Yeah.
those foods are delicious, they're healthy, and when you go to those parts of the world, obesity doesn't exist in the same way it does here. And so the processed food part is so important. It's difficult because I think we're all addicted to that stuff here in America,
Mhm.
but truly, it is very possible to get lentils and shrimp and be very intentional about pea proteins and hemp protein to really live optimally, to lose weight, to feel well during these fasting periods. I have the studies. I mean, I get labs on myself all the time, and my different people that I work with through this diet. I mean, they get healthier by every metric.
Really.
Their cholesterol decreases, their inflammatory markers decrease. Um, it's I always find it sort of a funny thing. Why do we fast 40 days going into, for Great Lent or before Nativity?
Mhm.
And the reason, well, I think is interesting. Again, comes from an ER doc. I don't mean to sound so doom and gloom, but like, who even says that you're going to live until Pascha this year? Or that your grandmother will, or that your uncle will. And the reality is that if you fast in this way, there are studies that show that in as little as 30 or 40 days, you can reverse a lot of these risk factors for heart disease, stroke, diabetes. I mean, it's powerful. So why
Yeah.
why is that important? It's because God doesn't want you burying your grandma on Pascha. Let's celebrate with the feasting. Let's do the famine so we can feast together and not confuse the day with mourning when it should be celebratory. And I bury people all the time on the holidays in the ER. It's
Right.
it's a sad thing, but it's confusing. But it's again, it's one of these things that God's like, okay, people, you know, put down your forks and knives and pick up your, spoons or something, and switch to something plant based for a while so that your family is intact for
Yeah.
the celebration, and that's a beautiful thing.
So 40 days is kind of that magic reset number.
It is. That's. I mean, it shows that there's literature out there. It's like, yeah, we put this person on a plant based diet for 40 days, and all these things that we were worried about with their atherosclerosis and coronary artery disease are improving substantially,
Mhm.
substantially.
And, like, I'm still new to learning the church calendar. This year was my first year of, like, trying to grasp what the heck is happening each day.
Yeah.
I know the nativity fast is 40 days, right?
Yeah, I think it's about 40 days, and the one for Great Lent is like 40 days plus another 8 or something because Lent and Holy Week are separate. So it's about 48 days for Great Lent,
And
with
aren't
the
there
Holy Week.
2 more fasts? Like, there's the Apostles'
Yes.
fast.
There's the Apostles' Fast, which depending on, what tradition you approach it from, can be as long as 5 weeks or as short as 2 weeks.
Okay.
And then there's a 2 weeks in August. I mean, it really when you do Wednesdays and Fridays and all these different things, it adds up to over half the year you're in a fasted state,
Yeah.
you know?
I
But,
think
like
that's why it's so
uh,
intimidating for some people to
it
start
is.
because it's like, if I start, do I have to do all of it, or is there a way to start, like, t to s take steps
Yeah.
into it?
Well, this is the funny thing. It's like, again, if you do these things as a system, so you're not just eating all the white bread and candy, and as much as you want, but you actually are intermittent fasting, so you get the growth hormone release. You're also resting your stomach enzymes too. Like a lot of people have ulcers in their stomach. Why is that? They're snacking. Every time they snack, they're secreting more acid in their stomach 11 times a day.
Yeah.
If you're only eating a few times a day, well, that's so many less rounds of your stomach being irritated by stomach acid. That stuff is caustic to break down food. It'll break down your stomach as well. Interesting. But the point is that you intermittent fast. You do the plant-based protein. You make sure the protein's high. You're doing this thing called walking that just kind of gets the circulation going, and suddenly you have more energy. Your satiety is up. You feel well. You're sleeping better. You're in more regularity and synchronized. Now it doesn't feel like as devastating as opposed to my 10-year-old husky self who was housing down white bread and probably shooting up my glucose and my insulin and then crashing an hour later and eating again and just that's madness.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's in this system with this way of Athos. I don't think it'll be as difficult. Give yourself 3 days to kind of like adjust. That's why I always like to tell people. But one way or another, you're going to feel better actually during that time than you ever have before. It's pretty magical.
Do you think people should start with, and I know this is like a spiritual father question as well, like talk to your spiritual father about when to start and what fast to jump into, but like the Wednesday, Fridays,
Mhm.
like somebody, so like say they're like, okay, I'm curious about this, but we just finished a fast. So you wouldn't be fasting with the church to jump into a 40 days right now, which maybe would be more helpful to do it alongside the church so that you have that support. So would you recommend like jump into the next Wednesday and Friday?
Yeah, I mean, again, I see the intention and the slow boil to getting it really right over years better than like trying to do it perfectly and just never getting anywhere. So in that way,
Yeah.
I feel the spiritual life is long, the spiritual life is forgiving, and we should take it seriously, right? Because every time we don't do it all, we're kind of shortchanging ourselves of a lot of healing, and shortchanging ourselves of a lot of ability to avoid tragedy. But with that
Yeah.
said, there's some urgency there. But with that said, I think it'd be very reasonable to really get good on the Wednesdays and Fridays because tomorrow will come and you can have all the all the food you want. And then at the same time, what I do personally, what I recommend to the Athos diet, because the Athos diet's written as a 48-day fast mimicking Great Lent. Okay, so it's
Okay.
just a starter. After that, I tell people, hey, do intermittent fasting every day. There's just no reason to ever stop that. And you could go
Mhm.
8 hours. You could maybe do it less. You could be more extreme maybe during the Lent if you want, but you could just go up to 8 hours, which is like 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. That doesn't sound
Okay.
terrible. 10 a.m. to
No.
6 p.m. It's 8 hours. And then, try to go as high protein as you can. So, if you're gonna have steak and sausages and fish, great. Do that. Lower the carbs. I just don't feel like there's ever a time in I don't even carbs must be useful for something, but it doesn't seem to be very good for human health, generally
Yeah.
speaking. But and then keep yourself active and so in other words, you're doing this intermittent fasting thing every day. You're trying to get high protein and low carbs every day, but when you can have the meat, you get the high protein that way. And when it's a Wednesday and Friday, you get through a plant-based. And maybe over the course of several weeks to months, now you have your like best meals that you create on Wednesdays and Fridays. Those are the go-to ones. You realized, oh, eating just 8 hours a day isn't the worst thing. You get there eventually. Now, let's put it this way: when your little baby, becomes not just a toddler but 7 years old, of course, it's always easier when they eat what parents eat and they're also fasting. But eventually, to them, they will just do it. Like people in Japan speak Japanese, like people in
Yeah.
Russia speak Russia. It's just like Japanese is one of the most difficult languages in the world to learn. But like every 4-year-old in Japan magically speaks it. Incredible.
Yeah.
And so I think it's the same thing with Orthodox fasting. So even if it's not for you to get perfect for your lifetime, your children and grandchildren will have the opportunity to optimize that, and that's a great blessing across generations.
Yeah, that part makes me emotional. Like, I started coming to the Orthodox Church when I was pregnant, and, like, God
Oh,
is so cool in that way that he drew me at that time. So
hmm.
now it's like I have the past couple years and maybe the next couple years to fail and try again and get it down by the time she knows what's going on and can
Yeah.
learn it and integrate it into her life.
Yeah, no, it is, and again, I think that perspective also is very important. It's like so much of what's in American society focuses on like the boomers becoming 65 and spending all their retirement money and not giving 2 cents about their kids and grandkids. Like, hey, through fasting, you might understand you're not just doing this for yourself, but you might be doing it
Yeah.
for, your grandchildren because you want them to live a healthy way of life. Like maybe now you won't just blow all your money on a jet ski and a power boat, although that'd be fun. But there's just a lot of stuff in America that's just really f inverted, and
Yeah.
a lot of older societies in other parts of the world are a lot more traditional for reasons that make a lot of practical sense, because
Yeah.
if you weren't born in the 1950s, when you bought your Manhattan house in 1970 for $20,000 and now you think you're really great because it's worth 2 million because of inflation and just the madness of America, well, I at my age can't go into Manhattan and buy a house for 20,000. It's 2 million. I'm
Yeah.
priced out. So the wisdom of the boomers is not applicable to all times. And so again, it's like there's certain things in our culture that allow us to thrive forever. And I think those are the things that we've forgotten a lot about in America because it's such a short-lived experiment. which is probably not going to last
Mhm.
much longer. But the point is
Yeah.
that there, there's just a lot of stuff there that I think that fasting, again, when you do it, you just become more real. You know, it's like there's so many wonderful ways to live in sort of an illusion or like a dreamlike state in America, and actually waking up is better than dreaming. Reality is
Mhm.
beautiful, and the more that we surround ourselves with those elements, the better.
Yeah, so many good points there. I always long to experience what it would be like to live in an Orthodox culture where
Yeah.
these things are just normal in our culture. Fasting is normal in our culture. Following the Orthodox calendar, the church calendar is normal in our culture. And I kind of am jealous of those people that do get to experience that. I feel like I always get comments too, check out Ethiopian food, and I
Mm.
see a lot of Ethiopian people, online, and I feel like they just I don't know, like, they've got something figured out too. They seem really close to all of this.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a great point. And I think it's something worth mentioning. The church is just so brilliant, and Christianity is so brilliant. And it's like, how do I get every follower across the world, regardless of time zone, culture, genetic profile, to be aligned with the greatest good, which is God? And you could say, well, I read my prayers, I go to church, I have a certain values that transmit through my personal life, family life, community. But what it doesn't address, unless you include fasting, is how do you go as deep as possible into yourself so that every
Mm,
cell in your body is resonating with the calendar of the church? And that's through
yeah,
fasting. It's like literally when you're fasting in this way and you're eating a certain way and eating a certain time and you're synchronized in a certain way, you are your every cell in your body is resonating with Christ at the highest level. That's like impossible, any other way. So like
yeah,
that's again why fasting is so paramount. It in the cadence of the church, Wednesdays and Fridays, the fast throughout the year, feasting and famine, every hour of my day when I begin to eat and when I end eating, all of this allows my cells to synchronize in that manner. And in that way, it's a very deep process. I
yeah,
don't know what else we could do to mimic that. I mean, I guess you could listen to music, but that doesn't affect your enteric nervous system.
mm-mm,
We could smell things. Even as beautiful as the incense is and the candlelight and the hymns, nothing trumps fasting. And so in that regard, if you want to align at the deepest level with the highest good, you need to fast, and that will get you into the deepest and most perfect alignment.
Have you had any, personal experiences where you were fasting and you felt extremely close to God or something in the spirit realm sort of became revealed to you?
This is a good question. I think that so let me first respond in like in medical jargon, and then I'll just talk as a human being. So first and foremost, it's interesting to me that when Christ heals the epileptic, because the apostles couldn't do it, the Christ takes care of it, right? He removes the child, almost falls into the fire, and he's had epilepsy his whole life. Then he's
Mm,
cured, and the apostles say, "Why couldn't we heal him?" And Christ says, "Some things cannot be healed other than through prayer and fasting, 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 fasting." So there was a Protestant doctor in the 1920s. His name was Dr. Conklin. He took this passage very seriously, and he took kids that were refractory to epilepsy. I mean, they could not you stop them from having seizures no matter what they did, and he made them fast. Now, in this case, it was no food at all. It was just like water and electrolytes. And lo and behold, all the seizure activity went away. And so the reason that is because when you start
mm,
when you get rid of all the sugar storage in your liver and your muscles and you start burning fat, you secrete ketones. That's sort of a breakdown of fat product. Ketones are very brain friendly. They go into the brain and they interact with these things called GABA receptors, and they reduce your threshold for having a seizure. They just calm the brain
hmm,
down. And what's so interesting about that is, you know, this technique is used even to this day because there are a lot of medications that will do that, but those medications make you feel tired and high and confused. Well, this is a natural way to do it. So they use a ketogenic diet basically to cure the epilepsy.
hmm,
Um, but when you're using ketones in the brain, you are thinking more clearly. Your anxiety is reduced because in fact GABA receptors are what benzodiazepines touch to get women and men and people of all shapes and kinds to feel less anxious. Well, you can just do
mm,
that naturally through fasting. So it's just interesting that like 25% of so many women in America and some percentage of men are struggling with this thing called anxiety, and it's disabling, and they're not leaving their homes, and they're, it's ruining their lives. If they just fasted in this particular manner, all of that would go away. Um, so as for my personal experience, it's a funny thing. I liken the spiritual life to two other things: the S&P 500. I'll make this connection in a sec, and athletes with their end of career documentaries. And these are what I mean to say. It turns out that if you wanted to invest in the S&P 500 over 30 years, if you missed 10 days of that money being in the market, like you were trying to time it and you're saying, "Oh, I'm going to pull out today because something might go wrong." If you missed just 10 days of those 30 years of investing opportunity, you would lose 50 to 80% of your portfolio's value. Okay? So why is that important? It means that if you don't show up every day, that those rare moments of epiphany, euphoria, progress, you miss out on them. It's
Mhm.
why we tell people to go to church every week. It's like, gosh, I know this week is just like the next week to some extent, but you're not in it for like 1,000th of today's effect, getting you slowly up in your spiritual life. No, no, no. There's going to be flat lines, and there's going to be a pulse, and there's a flat line and a pulse. But
Mm.
you don't know when that's going to be. And so you
Yes.
have to show up to every game. So that's the S&P 500 analogy. Another thing too is I watched some pretty cool documentaries on some phenomenal athletes. I'm specifically a rugby guy, but whatever. And I was really depressed after watching this guy's 60-minute long documentary that like his entire 20-year career could be summarized in like 60 minutes. Like as if all of that was just for 5 30-second runs, and like that's what he was known for. Now I'm reducing it a lot, but you need 20 years in a career of athleticism to have those 30 moments that matter. And I think the spiritual life moves the same way in that you need to show up to every fast ready. You need to get to church ready so that in your own way, God can kind of touch you in a special time and moment, and you don't miss out on that because you just never know. It's like a
Yeah.
thief in the night.
Wow, that's so good. I think that's so real. Like, yes, that's how I experience God too. It's like this moment and then it's gone and it feels like that flat line until the next moment and
Yeah.
just keep waiting for the next moment. So yeah,
Yeah.
you have to show up and be ready.
It's funny though too. I was at a conference once. Maybe this is me speaking more directly now about your question, but I was at a conference once. There was this lovely lady there that she was a beauty queen or something, and before she became a beauty queen, like she had a really troubled life. She was in an abusive relationship. She was assaulted, drug issues, crime, all sorts of stuff. And as the conference was going on, she eventually explains to her that she had a life-changing moment where God appeared to her and he describes him in all these colors, and she gave herself to Christ, and her life went in a different direction, and now she's like a beauty queen talking about health and wellness. Like good for her. But
Mhm.
I don't know if it was my medical background or whatever, but like I just couldn't believe her story. Like I didn't believe that God appeared to her in that visual way. Like, is she Moses? Is she Solomon? Is she David? Like, is that possible? And what's so funny? At first, I was like kind of a little resentful, and then an hour passed by, and I was like, God, you know, I'm Orthodox. I've been doing all these different things. Like, why haven't you appeared to me
Yeah.
in this way? Like, where's our relationship? Like, what happened to your good and faithful servant? I mean, I'm just saying this more for joking than being literal
Yes.
here.
I get you
And
though.
and another few hours passed, and I had an epiphany. And the epiphany was this: I've never been abused by my father. I've never been, addicted to drugs. I've never been neglected or starved. I've never been arrested. Like God has been taking care of me. Like
Yeah.
I don't need circus acts for him to show me that he cares. And so in
Mhm.
that regard, it's like this fasting principle. It's just like this prevention. Like, what parent, I mean, we both love we all love our children, but like if you prevent them from falling off the ledge, that might be even better than letting them fall off the ledge and then mending their bones. Like
Right.
and so in that regard, like God loves us in many different ways. And I think, that preventative medicine sort of approach is very, it is an act of love, even though it doesn't come with as much euphoria. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's an amazing reminder for those who are walking faithfully, and it's like that quiet peace of whereas, like, before when I was living a crazy life, I had these radical spiritual encounters as well
Yeah.
because I feel like God was trying to get my attention, like, "Hey,
Yes.
girl, like, let's do something different," "Here I am." But then when you've been following him and you're living, like, in at home with him, it can feel quieter, but n we shouldn't take for granted that protection, like you said, because it's he shows up and loves us in many different ways.
Yeah, like, I don't need to be in Ukraine having bombs dropped on my house and all manner of insanity so that I can see, an angel flying, like,
Yeah.
I'd rather just go to church, and have communion and listen to the hymns
Yeah.
and benefit in that way. Um, one other thing I wanted to mention on trauma, though, I thought this was very important in regards to our discussion on healing. I don't know if you ever heard of the ACE study. ACE study. So the
No.
ACE study was a study about 17,000 children in the 80s and 90s. They followed them through their whole lives. I think they finished the study around that time, but they followed these 17,000 children, and they noticed that a small cohort of them died 20 years ahead of everyone else, was homeless, divorced, couldn't hold a job, addicted to drugs, alcoholism, suicide, etc. And they asked themselves, like, what is going on with this small group of people, all things considered, that resulted in this? What's the cause? And they determined that it all stemmed back to their childhood, that they had undergone these experiences of neglect, abuse, turmoil in many different ways, terrible things, all things that we can only sometimes see and never actually imagine. But and these things were physically and literally shortening their lives and essentially destining them to a life of suffering, in the most
Mhm.
tragic way. What's also interesting is that those same children, let's say when they got through the foster system, etcetera, even though that those environmental experiences ended, they still died. They still had the problems. And again, it's this exposure, it's this neglect, it's this trauma they had as children. It was 4 events. If you had 4 events or more, it was considered to be, a very strong correlation. Things would not go well. Of course, there were always exceptions, but that was generally the statistic. And what my the reason I even came across this study is that when I was doing rotations in psychiatric facilities across Pennsylvania when I was a medical student, I kept meeting these men and women in their 40s, 50s, 60s even, and when I'm trying to get to understand them, they always started in their childhood. It wasn't like
Right.
what happened the last 6 months or there's something so imprinting, so formative, so important. I also think culturally why we try to protect our children and keep them safe and, it's so important, but anyway, the point is that if these experiences can destroy a person's life, then things like fasting and the church and a loving environment in the home can extend their lives. Like
I
there's got
agree.
to be an opposite. And so, in some ways, I think it's so important to realize that one of the reasons we bring our children to church at a young age, why we have them, start confession at an early age, why we have them fast and be altar boys and, participate in the sacraments is because through those positive childhood experiences, we extend their lives and maybe we counter some of the damage that they've undergone. So
Mhm.
in regards to healing, I think the process of healing occurs is first of all as a preventative measure. Second, it needs to happen at an early age and it needs to be repeated over and over and over again. Um, and I think fasting can be a part of that tool set.
Wow. I love that you brought that up. One of the priests I talked to, Father Ivan Chandra, we were talking about healing and these things. Maybe I mentioned this, but how this is what kept me strong the last time I did fast, and it's been a little while, but the
Mhm.
last time I did fast, I was hearing Father Ivan in my head
Hmm.
talking about how we do these things because this is our healing.
Hmm.
It's not like, "Oh, I have to fast. I'm an Orthodox Christian, so I have to fast on these days," but that every time we obey and do what we know we're supposed to do and follow these ascetic practices, like you said, the confession, the fasting, these different things, this is where we heal and
Yes.
how we heal. Um,
Yes.
so yeah, that's something I took with me and something I remind myself when I do fast and I'm in the struggle of that fasting is that this is how because I'm a child abuse survivor as well. So similar to those case studies, I'm like, how can I become a fully healed person? And so this is one of the things that I know I want to do. And get better at so that I can continue to heal too.
Yeah, the church has been around for millennia. It has wisdom. It has all the case studies in the world. It has sort of this divine intuition as to what happens to people, and priests that have been giving counsel to individuals for so many years and so many scenarios. And in a certain sense, a person opening up about their soul to their priest is really an insight that, like, maybe a psychiatry survey might maybe mimic, but probably not,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah.
And people lie on surveys all the time, by the way. But, at least you go into confession, really putting yourself out there. And fasting is so important too because it teaches you integrity. No one knows if you're eating or not. No one knows if you failed or not. No one knows if you should be celebrating that you got through the fast or not. Like, it's just you and God, and
Yeah.
and in that regard too, like, you're feeling what that is at a visceral level. And when you can't ignore yourself and you learn through something like fasting how to face yourself, how to succeed when no one else is watching, how to not do the wrong thing when no one else is watching, that's a very powerful experience to have at all ages. And
Mhm.
and again, the spiritual life is long, and I think the idea is that we're all supposed to last to the 11th hour and longer. And so, just the goal is to end up in the right spot eventually. That's the key.
Yeah. Yeah, wonderful. I don't know if I have anything else to add to
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, no, it's great. Mikhail, I really appreciate your time and again, the work that you're doing online. And the reality is that in this day and age of families that I think 75% of African American families are just with a single mom. 25% of let's say Caucasian Americans are in single family homes. Divorce is 40%. Addiction is out of control.
Yeah.
It's like we need to be able to pull people out from where they are and bring them to the faith. And it's not just for numbers. Like, we're not even priests getting a salary or something. Like, we
Yeah.
just know that this life in the Orthodox Church is a blessed path. It has been walked many times, although it's difficult, but it is worth the struggle. And um, I think with this little ortho verse of people that are apologetics in their own way, are apostles in their own way, bringing people to the faith. God bless your work. I think it's very relevant and timely, and we just need more people that can relate and connect us with our Orthodox faith. So God bless your work and everything you've done so far. I think it's awesome to follow you along these years. Actually, been watching your stuff. So
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you coming on to share this next level. It's I don't think I was recording yet when I said it's crazy that I was talking with these priests about healing,
oh yeah,
and next thing you're the next guest to talk about this very practical way of continuing to heal. So it was very timely, and I appreciate you being here with us today as well. Can you tell the listeners how they can find you, get your book, get
thank
involved
you.
in your program?
Yeah, yeah. So the website's called theathosdiet.com, and we have great material on there. You can buy the book. It's on Amazon. It's sold in almost every continent, actually. And there are Orthodox Christians everywhere. But if we just took this practice seriously, there'd be 300 million of us that would be wonderful spouses, wonderful employees, wonderful employers, wonderful children,
Yeah.
and all the while prevent a lot of suffering, a tidal wave of suffering, which I see too often in the emergency room. But if you go to theathosdiet.com, I think there's a nice little succinct way for us to kind of take this, make the menial blessed, the mundane worthwhile and meaningful. And there's a YouTube channel where I just talk to 3 to 5 minutes at a time and just give people little pointers about the best practices for fasting. But much of what we talked
Perfect.
about and more. So that's where you can find me.
Well, that's it, folks. Gonna attempt another year of growing more in a raised and redeemed life by following the Orthodox fasts. Thank you so much for listening. If you didn't know, I did start a membership on here as well on YouTube, if you're listening from YouTube, where you can get more behind the scenes content. I'm sharing more personal vlog style content behind the scenes behind-the-scenes stuff over there. So if you are interested, be sure to check out the membership. And if you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up, leave a comment, and share it with anyone you think may need to hear this message. I'm personally going to be sending it to my husband so we can work on growing in this together as a family. It is my full intention for the next video to be the start to a new series about Orthodox Christian perspectives on New Age things. So stay tuned, and I'll see you guys soon.